All right, welcome back. It's been a while, but I'm glad that you are here to join me today. We have a wonderful thing to talk about, something I think at some point in our lives each of us encounters. So, we're talking about not just are you setting a boundary, but are you managing a reaction? Let's chat about response management. So, welcome to Illumina. This is a space to slow down, to turn inward, to reconnect with parts of ourselves that can sometimes become difficult to hear beneath the expectations, relationships, and the noise of everyday life. Today, I want to talk about boundaries, but not really about how to set them. I think we all know how to set them. And we hear a lot about boundaries. Learn to say no, protect your peace, stop people pleasing, choose yourself. And while all of that sounds wonderful, actually doing it can feel very different. Because I've been reflecting lately on something I hadn't fully recognized before. Sometimes we aren't struggling to identify the boundary at all. We already know what we want. We know we don't want to go. We know we don't want to continue an arrangement. We know something in a relationship just doesn't feel good for us anymore. We know we don't have the capacity. We know we want more distance. We know the answer is no. The boundary is actually quite clear to us. What we're struggling with is what might happen after we set it. Will they be angry? Will they think I'm selfish? Will they misunderstand me? Will they talk about me? Will things become awkward? Will they withdraw? And will they think I'm a bad person? And suddenly we're not really working on the boundary anymore. We're trying to manage the other person's response to it. And I've started thinking about this as response management. And once I noticed it, I started seeing it everywhere. Think about the last time that you wanted to say no to something. Take a moment and think about it. Maybe someone asked you for a favor. Maybe you were invited somewhere you didn't want to go. Maybe someone wanted your time when you didn't have any left to give. Maybe an arrangement that once worked for you simply doesn't anymore. Your first internal response might have been incredibly clear for you. No. And then the negotiations began. Well, maybe I'm being unreasonable. They've done things for me before. Maybe I should give it a little longer. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I haven't tried hard enough. Maybe I should wait and see what they do. And this is something I find extremely fascinating, folks. Sometimes we aren't waiting because we genuinely need more information to set that boundary. We're waiting for enough evidence to give ourselves permission to do what we already know we need to do and we already know we want to do, almost as though our own discomfort isn't sufficient enough. We need a case. We need evidence. We need the other person to behave badly enough that our boundary becomes indisputable, because then we don't have to feel guilty. Then we can say, see, now I'm allowed to set this boundary. But what if someone doesn't have to become the villain of the story for you to decide that something no longer works for you? Hear that. For you to decide that something no longer works for you. Nobody else can tell you what that is but you. So I think many people who struggle with people pleasing, they have an imaginary courtroom inside them. I myself, I have been here many times before. Before they are allowed to say no, they present the evidence. Have I been patient enough? Have I given enough chances? Was what they did really that bad? Am I being too sensitive? Did I contribute to this? And that self-reflection, that is very important. We shouldn't stop that. We should be willing to examine ourselves. But sometimes self-reflection quietly turns into self-cross-examination. We're no longer trying to understand the situation. We're trying to determine whether we have earned the right to trust ourselves. And perhaps this is something worth hearing today. You don't always need another person to be wrong in order for something to be wrong for you. You don't need to diagnose them. You don't need to prove malicious intent, and you don't need everybody else to agree with your interpretation of events. Sometimes this doesn't feel good anymore. This arrangement no longer works for me. I don't want to continue this. That is information. And sometimes, you know what? That is enough. But even when we finally recognize a boundary, another layer can often appear. We start thinking about how the other person will respond and how people around them will respond, and then what will that look like? And suddenly we become strategists. We explain, we soften, we apologize, we anticipate objections, we rehearse conversations that haven't even happened yet, and we try and find the perfect wording. Maybe you've written a completely reasonable message, then you reread it 5 times. You changed the wording. You added an exclamation point because that period suddenly looked angry. And then you added a smiley face. And then another sentence explaining yourself. And then I hope that's okay. And now somehow you're asking permission to have the boundary that you have just communicated for you. And then you press send. And then the monitoring begins. And I have been here a million times. Did they read it? Are they typing? Why haven't they responded yet? Was that response shorter than usual? Did that period mean something? Are they angry? And without realizing it, we've handed another person the remote control to our nervous system. If they respond warmly, we may feel a sense of relief. If they respond coldly, we may have a sense of alarm. If they don't respond at all, whew, then our brain just opens a investigation. And this is where boundaries become about much more than communication. They become about our ability to tolerate another person's emotional experience without immediately making it our responsibility. And where does this come from? Why do we have these reactions in the first place? Because for many of us, response management didn't appear out of nowhere. We learned it. Maybe you grew up reading the room. Maybe you could tell someone's mood by the way they walked into the house. Maybe anger felt unpredictable. Maybe silence meant something was wrong. Maybe being agreeable kept things peaceful. Maybe being helpful earned praise. Maybe being easygoing helped you belong. And maybe you became the child who didn't create problems for others, the peacekeeper, the helper, the one who adapted for everybody else's comfort. Nobody necessarily told you your job is to manage everyone else's feelings. Really hear that. Your job is to manage everyone else's feelings. It kind of sounds weird when we really think about that, right? We're not even getting paid for that in the first place. But your nervous system may have learned something very similar. If they're okay with me, I'm safe. And that belief can travel remarkably well. It follows us into friendships, workplaces, families, romantic relationships. And suddenly we're adults still scanning the room, still anticipating, still accommodating, still explaining, and still making ourselves smaller so nobody else becomes uncomfortable around us. And sometimes we're so practiced at reading everyone else that we stop noticing ourselves. And I want to make an important distinction here. Caring about other people's feelings is healthy. Empathy matters. Compromise matters. Accountability matters. Sometimes we hurt people. Sometimes we get things wrong. Sometimes someone's reaction contains information that we genuinely need to hear to grow ourselves. Healthy boundaries aren't an excuse to walk through life saying, your feelings aren't my problem. But there is an enormous difference between caring about someone's feelings and taking full responsibility for making sure they never have uncomfortable feelings about us. There's a difference between I care that you're disappointed and I cannot tolerate you being disappointed in me. There's a difference between I want to communicate this kindly and I need to communicate this so perfectly that you cannot possibly misunderstand me. There's a difference between I want you to understand and I need you to understand before I'm allowed to trust myself. And somewhere along that line, consideration can quietly become self-abandonment. There's another part of people pleasing that I don't think we talk enough about. It's that internal negotiation we kind of mentioned earlier. So we finally hear ourselves say, I don't want this anymore. And almost immediately, another voice responds, Are you sure? Maybe give it another week. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe you're being unfair. Maybe just wait and see what they do. We kind of chatted about that earlier. Sometimes, yes, those questions are very useful, but sometimes they're simply delaying the discomfort of acting on what we already know. And I think this is where we can ask ourselves something very simple. Am I waiting because I genuinely need more information? Or am I waiting for the other person to make this decision easier for me? Because if they behave badly enough, we don't have to own the choice. They made us do it. Their behavior justified it. And that can feel safer for us. But there's another possibility here. Maybe we can make decisions based on our own internal information without needing somebody else to cross one final line first. There's power in that. There's power in owning our truth and standing in that power of trusting ourselves and trusting what we know is best for us. And then there's another layer. The moment when we're hurt and suddenly the boundary starts carrying a little extra charge. Maybe we want to withdraw, remove access, stop responding, cancel something, disconnect. And somewhere underneath it is, maybe then they'll understand. Maybe they'll realize I'm hurt. Maybe they'll finally see what they've done. This is such a human impulse. When we feel powerless, action can often restore a sense of control within us. But it's worth asking, am I setting this boundary because it genuinely reflects what I want and what I need? Or am I using the boundary to communicate something I'm not saying directly? Because boundaries can become covert messages. And when that happens, we're still deeply invested in the response. We're hoping they'll notice, hoping they'll understand, maybe even hoping they'll feel something in return. And sometimes the healthiest boundary is the one we no longer need the other person to notice. No performance, no announcement, no punishment. Just, this doesn't work for me anymore. This doesn't work for me anymore. And then comes the guilt, something we also don't talk about enough. This can be a really powerful one. You finally say no. You finally step back. You finally stand in your power. You finally stop doing something you never really wanted to keep doing in the first place. But instead of feeling liberated, you feel awful. Your stomach turns, your mind races, you start reconsidering your boundary. Was that mean? Should I undo it? Maybe I overreacted. And because that guilt feels so uncomfortable, we sometimes assume it must be giving us important moral information. But guilt doesn't always mean that we've violated our values. Sometimes that guilt appears because we've violated an old role that we were hanging on to. The role of being accommodating, the role of keeping everyone happy around us, the role of never creating conflict, the role of being the easy one. And when we stop performing that role, our nervous system may interpret the change as danger. So perhaps sometimes guilt doesn't mean we've done something wrong. Sometimes guilt appears because we've stopped doing something that was wrong for us. Sometimes guilt appears because we've stopped doing something that was wrong for us. That doesn't mean we ignore guilt. We get curious about it. Did I behave in a way that conflicts with my values? If yes, then repair it. But if the answer is no, maybe the task isn't to undo the boundary. Maybe the task is learning to tolerate the feeling. This may be one of the hardest pieces. Someone can misunderstand you even when you've done nothing wrong, and that's a hard one. That's really a tough one. You can communicate so thoughtfully, and someone can still think you're being selfish. You can be overly compassionate and kind, but someone can still feel hurt. You can make a healthy decision, and someone can tell a completely different story about why you made it. And sometimes you will never get the opportunity to correct their version of you. For people who've spent a lifetime trying to be understood, liked, accepted, or seen as good, and I am one of them, I'm standing in that line, this can just feel unbearable. We want to explain, to clarify, to correct, make sure that they know our true intentions, but we cannot control the version of ourselves that exists in every other person's mind, and that is different for every single person in our life. People experience us through their own histories, their own expectations, their own needs, their own wounds, and their own beliefs. And sometimes part of becoming more deeply rooted in ourselves is learning I don't have to chase every misunderstanding. Someone is allowed to think I'm wrong. Someone is allowed to be disappointed in me. Someone is even allowed to dislike me. And none of those automatically tell me who I am as a person. Maybe this is a shift at the heart of it all. Are you okay with me versus am I okay with me? For so long, the unconscious question can be, are you okay with me? Are you happy with my decision? Do you understand? Do you still like me? Are we okay? Did I upset you? But what happens when we turn inward and we ask ourselves, am I okay with me? Am I okay with this boundary I set? Did I behave according to my values? Was I respectful? Was I honest? Was I intentionally cruel? Is there something I genuinely need to take responsibility for here? If there was, like I mentioned, I can repair that. But if there isn't, perhaps someone else's discomfort doesn't automatically mean I've done something wrong. And that's a very different way of living. Sometimes relationships change. They often do change because we change. Sometimes something that once felt reciprocal stops feeling reciprocal. Sometimes we realize we're maintaining something mostly because ending or changing often feels uncomfortable for us. And then there can be a temptation to gather evidence, as we chatted about earlier, to keep proving to ourselves why we're justified in stepping back. But perhaps we don't need to turn someone into, like I mentioned earlier, a villain or a terrible person in order to release our own attachment to them. Maybe they aren't terrible, and they probably aren't. Maybe something simply just isn't right for us anymore. And perhaps the question isn't, are they bad enough for me to leave? Maybe the question is, who am I becoming when I stay? Do I like how I feel in this relationship? Am I constantly anxious, second guessing, monitoring, shrinking, over explaining, trying to earn something? Because sometimes releasing a relationship isn't deciding someone else is bad. It's simply deciding we no longer want to keep overriding ourselves in order to maintain it. And here's something else I think truly matters. We talk about having the courage to set a boundary, but there's another kind of courage required afterwards. The courage to stay with ourselves once we've done it. And this can be really difficult. Easier said than done. Because the nervous system may react, and it may react and respond very heavily. Your chest may tighten, your stomach may drop, your brain starts imagining several different consequences. Maybe you desperately want reassurance that everything is and will be okay. And this is often the moment when we undo ourselves. We send another message. We explain a little more. We offer something else. We backtrack. We apologize when we haven't actually done anything wrong. So maybe boundary work isn't finished when we say no. Sometimes that's where the deeper work begins. Can I feel that discomfort without immediately fixing it? And often my recommendation to clients will be Never respond immediately because oftentimes we're responding with our nervous system and we're not in a state where we can make rational decisions. Always try and give it 24 hours, minimum a couple hours. Allow your body to regulate, allow your prefrontal cortex to come back online, which will allow you to look at things from kind of more of a problem solving, solution focused, rational angle. And can we allow another person to just have their response? They're entitled to a response without rushing to regulate it. Can I experience guilt without assuming guilt means wrongdoing? Can I tolerate being misunderstood without writing a dissertation defending myself? And can I remain connected to myself even when someone else isn't pleased with me? So wherever you are right now, I want you to think about one place in your life where you've been struggling with a boundary. It doesn't need to be something overly dramatic. Sometimes the smallest moments reveal our deepest patterns. Maybe you're saying yes when you want to say no. Maybe you're continuing to do something or be something that no longer feels right for you. Maybe you're giving someone access to your time or energy because taking it back feels uncomfortable. Maybe you're waiting for someone else to do one more thing before you finally give yourself permission to step away. Maybe you're rehearsing an explanation. Maybe you're monitoring someone's reaction. And maybe you're trying desperately not to be misunderstood. Perhaps ask yourself, do I actually not know what I want? Or do I know what I want and I'm afraid of what might happen if I honor it? Take a breath with me. Inhale and exhale. Notice what happens in your body. Maybe there's tightness. Maybe there's anxiety. Maybe there's guilt. You don't need to change it. Simply notice it. And then ask yourself, what am I afraid their reaction would mean about me? What am I afraid their reaction would mean about me? That I'm selfish, unkind, difficult, unlovable, too much, not enough. Oftentimes, this can stir up core beliefs deep within our system that aren't even related to the situation that's unfolding. And if something comes up for you, just meet it gently, because perhaps that's a part of you that's been trying so hard to keep everybody else okay. And maybe that part doesn't need criticism. Maybe it simply needs reassurance. You can remind yourself, someone else's disappointment does not determine my worth. Someone else's misunderstanding does not define my intention. Someone else's discomfort does not automatically mean I've done something wrong. And perhaps I don't need you to be okay with my boundary in order for me to be okay with my boundary. Take another slow breath in. Let that settle. Maybe the deepest work of boundaries isn't learning how to push people away. Maybe it's learning how to stop leaving ourselves, stop abandoning what feels right for us, to care about other people without disappearing inside their needs, to love without overfunctioning, to be compassionate without becoming responsible for everyone else's emotional weather, to hear another person's disappointment without immediately abandoning our own truth, to let someone misunderstand us without desperately chasing after them with an explanation, to let guilt rise and fall without automatically interpreting it as a command to go backwards. And perhaps, most importantly, to stop asking everyone else around us for permission to trust what we already know. So this week, friends, notice. Notice when you're explaining something that doesn't actually require an explanation. Notice when you're collecting evidence to justify something you already know. Notice when you're negotiating against yourself. Notice when you're trying to manage somebody else's reaction. And notice when a boundary starts becoming a message you want someone else to receive. And notice what happens inside you after you finally choose yourself. You don't have to judge any of it, just become curious. And maybe ask, can I stay connected to myself here? Because perhaps that's what boundaries are really asking of us. Not can I control what happens next, because we can't, but can I trust myself even when I can't? Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and each other.